Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have received support in different ways from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Dr. Cynthia B. Meyers is Professor Emerita of Communication, Art, and Media at College of Mount St. Vincent. Cynthia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you are currently researching and writing about?
Well, I researched the history of advertising agencies and their role in American broadcasting, and I argue that they essentially built American commercial broadcasting. They were very involved in the creation of programs in the 1930s, 40s, and 1950s. Therefore, they were the ones actually producing. J. Walter Thompson produced Kraft Music Hall, and BBD&O famously produced Cavalcade of America, which we'll come back to. So they were very involved in shaping popular culture as well as advertising texts. And also they were really important in terms of shaping the development of 20th century capitalism. They were advising the leaders. BBD&O in particular was deeply involved in public relations, corporate image advertising, then called institutional advertising. They were helping with merchandising, marketing, product development. BBD&O had a test kitchen for Betty Crocker products. They were actually testing recipes. They were deeply involved in all sorts of activities that shaped 20th century American capitalism or business industries, particularly consumer products, but lots of things. So I look at their radio and television work. And I was at Hagley looking at BBD&O in particular. Now, BBD&O happens to be one of my favorite ad agencies because they were one of the most important ad agencies in the 20th century. Their clients included General Motors, General Electric, DuPont, U.S. Steel. Then they went on American Tobacco, Lever Brothers. Some of the largest and most important American corporations were clients of BBD&O. And BBD&O is key to understanding how the ad industry developed and how a number of major American corporations communicated about themselves to the public.
Mm-hmm. Well, for those not familiar, could you introduce us to the firm BBD&O?
Sure. So it starts as the George Batten Company back in 1891. And at Hagley, we actually have a bunch of Batten documents. So if you're interested in 19th century advertising, Batten was a pioneer in advertising in religious media, actually, publications, magazines, newspapers. So we have Hagley has amazing material on that. In 1918, Bruce Barton, Roy Durstein, and Alex Osborne got together and created what they called BDO. And then they merged with Batten in 1928. Bruce Barton is the most famous of the founders. He wrote the 1925 book, The Man Nobody Knows, which is about Jesus Christ sort of being an ad man. But I really have to emphasize here that at that time, they saw their job as advertising as a service, advertising as informational, advertising as an uplifting form of content that would sort of acclimate and clue consumers in to the modern world. And Bruce Barton in particular talked a lot about how advertising would prevent fraud because manufacturers would have to be honest and make informational claims that consumers could test for themselves. And he really, they talked a lot about advertising as, being something that would improve business and improve the consumer experience. Alex Osborne was the inventor of brainstorming. If you've ever heard that term, brainstorming, which is a group of people get in a room and they just throw ideas around, and the more the better. Alex Osborne developed this technique, and it's still used in many corporations, not just ad agencies today. So if you're at all interested in, how companies have tried to come up with ideas or come up with, ways to solve problems. You want to look at Alex Osborne, and a lot of his writings and speeches and materials are at the Hagley. Finally, Roy Durstein, the fourth founder I'm going to mention, leaves the agency in 1939. But before that, he's the new media guy. He's the one pushing the ad agency into radio, which was a brand new, it's new medium. It was like the internet of the 1920s, and that nobody really knew how to use it. Nobody knew how to commercialize it. Nobody knew how to monetize it. And he was one of the people really arguing that advertisers needed to buy airtime and use it to promote themselves, and to create relationships with consumers so that consumers could feel good about that, the company, their client. He was also very involved in film. They had an industrial film department. They made minute movies that were shown in movie theaters. So they were very new media oriented. And one of the radio shows that I've written about that BBD&O produced, and by produced, I mean produced, they wrote them, they cast them, they scripted them, they scored the music. Arthur Pryor, who was the head of the radio department, was actually writing the music for these live nationally broadcast television shows. So one of the ones they did was March of Time. So you might have heard of the newsreel, The March of Time, but before it was a filmed newsreel, it was a radio show that BBD&O produced for Time magazine. And it was a kind of journalism that is, let's say, out of favor today, but not really. It was a docudrama. It was scripted nonfiction. So it was fictionalized nonfiction. So they had actors pretending to be President Roosevelt or Hitler. And Hitler always spoke with a German accent, which I always found very amusing. So they were really, really important to understanding not just how new media like radio and then television developed, but they were the ones who were also trying to figure out how to make it work, how to appeal to audiences. They didn't just put stuff on the air and say, okay, you should believe that DuPont is a great company. They were a little more subtle than that. They created Cavalcade of America. And again, the DuPont papers and the BBD&O papers have a lot of information about why and how they created that program. It was a docudrama about the history of American technology, right? Because DuPont was an important early technology company and chemical company. And BBD&O, by the way, was the agency that came up with better living through chemistry, that slogan. Better things for better living through chemistry. Yes, that's what it is. So when they created Cavalcade of America, DuPont, was on the defensive after a number of hearings, accusing it of being, having done the wrong thing during World War I. And so merchants of death, I think was the phrase. So it was a public relations effort. It was an educational effort. It was an advertising effort. It was an entertainment effort. So by the 1940s, they hired top movie stars to come on and do these live broadcasts where they were reading these docudrama scripts and pretending to be Abraham Lincoln. I think Raymond Massey was Abraham Lincoln. And, and I think that what's really interesting to me about this is how using entertainment to inform the public, and realizing that just lecturing or just being didactic wasn't good enough to sort of convey or engage with the public. And so another reason that I study advertising is because I think it's the media industry that is most upfront about what it's trying to do, which is to attract audience attention and try to get us to pay attention to, products or corporate image. But often they use strategies that are common in all sorts of other media as well, in terms of narrative strategies or emotional appeals or what have you. So I encourage scholars to open their minds to looking not just at the advertising agencies, but at the advertising itself. Because when a company decides to advertise and they choose an agency often based on that agency's ad strategies. So BBD&O was really famous for institutional or corporate image advertising. That is, if you wanted to burnish your corporate image for the public, you went to BBDO. Young Rubicam was really famous for soft sell, where they were really humorous and tongue-in-cheek and ironic. So they were producing Jack Benny and Fred Allen on 30s and 40s radio, where they did a lot of spoofing of advertising. J. Walter Thompson was really famous for using celebrities. So they had lots and lots of stars. Kraft Music Hall was hosted by Bing Crosby. So each of these agencies reflects something on the corporation that hires them. So a company that hires an agency is also saying something about what it thinks of itself, you know, what it wants to convey to the public. And so if you start to look at the agency and the advertising, you can get a sense of how the corporate leadership is imagining itself, like what it, not just in terms of, you know, making itself look good, but it's thinking in terms of how it's thinking about its market and its consumer, how it's identifying who those people are, in part by the advertising strategies they use and the ad agencies that they choose. So I'm just going to go right ahead and make another pitch for using ad agency archives, which is that there are not that many of them. Walter Thompson down at Duke University is the most complete archive that we have of 20th century advertising agency practice. And they have records about, you know, Ford and Kraft and Lever Brothers, you know, major companies. But BBDO is now at Hagley. And I think it's really important that scholars understand that it's hard to figure out which ad agency was involved with which client. And then if they're involved in a client, so for example, BBDO had Lever Brothers, but so did J. Walter Thompson. Different products were handled by different agencies. And then often the clients or the advertisers would rotate the products among different ad agencies. So Procter Gamble would switch, you know, products among agents. They had like 7 different agencies. So it's not a simple matter to kind of connect the agency, the ad, the product, and the company. And the other problem is that ad agencies never got public attribution. So if you go to a movie, you see, you know, this was produced by Warner Brothers, right? You know, the studio, you know, the director, you know, the screenwriter, et cetera, et cetera. You have metadata on the screen. When you watch a television commercial or look at a magazine ad, there's no metadata there. The only information you have is the product name. And in the age of conglomeration, or in the age of massive consumer packaged goods companies like Procter and Gamble and Lever Brothers, you don't even know which brands go with which company, because there's so many of them. Procter and Gamble has hundreds of brands, right? So there's no public attribution. And this was especially true on radio and television, where BBDO was producing the March of Time, but there's nothing at the end. It says, this is brought to you by the editors of Time. And yes, the editors of Time told them which stories to cover that week, but it was BBDO that was actually scripting it and inventing it and producing it. There was no, you know, BBDO personnel actually made this program. So very few people are aware of just how important a role ad agencies have played in popular culture in American media. So when you get to the 1950s and 60s, the ad agencies stopped doing the script writing. They just do the oversight, which is that they're making sure that the programs aren't going to reflect badly on their clients. So BBDO is working with Armstrong Cork and the David Susskind production company, and they're saying, no, we can't do a show about race, race, because the Southern stations will cancel the show. So they're very carefully watching and making sure that nothing goes through that they think might reflect badly on their client. But they are overseeing programs. So BBDO was overseeing Lassie for Campbell Soup for a while. They were overseeing General Electric Theater, U.S. Steel's Theater Guild on the Air, which then turned into U.S. Steel Hour. And of course, for DuPont, they kept doing Cavalcade, which then turned into the DuPont show, which then turned into the DuPont show of the month, and so on. So they were very involved all the way up through the mid to late 60s in overseeing the program content for their clients. And then by the 1960s, it's the rise of the age of the commercial. And this is also really interesting with BBDO. They got the Pepsi account in the 1960s. And if you've ever seen any Pepsi advertising, most of it was created at BBDO. So all the pop stars who changed their pop song lyrics, like Michael Jackson and Madonna, they were starting that in the early 60s. Pepsi, for those who think young, the Pepsi generation. I'm sorry, but I think it's a really major late 20th century set of cultural texts that definitely deserves a book or two to analyze the role of BBDO in those kinds of campaigns. They also got really involved in market research. They got interested in management science, optimization, computerization. They were one of the first agencies to buy a giant computer to, figure out what media to buy, that is, where to buy airtime on TV most of the time. They were the ones who were doing all sorts of quantitative and qualitative market research. So at Hagley, there's a huge number of marketing research studies for all different kinds of products. They did whole product categories: shampoo, margarine, automobiles. They had the Dodge account for a while, and they had an account called Dodge Fever with sexy girls in hot pants on top of Dodge cars. They became one of the largest television commercial production companies, so that hundreds and hundreds of different commercials every year they produced. But you never knew when you were watching a TV commercial in the 60s whether or not you were watching a BBDO commercial. So it's only if you go into the archives that you can start making those connections. You can say, oh, I know BBDO had the Pepsi account, let me go look at all these Pepsi ads and Pepsi commercials and let me try to connect some dots here. Also, at Hagley, they have what are called tear sheets. So every time a BBDO created print ad would run in a magazine like Saturday Evening Post or Life magazine, somebody would tear out that piece of paper with the ad and they'd put it in a file folder marked with that client, and they'd put the date on it. This is extraordinarily useful because then you can know, like, especially when accounts would shift around, you could say, okay, now I know that BBDO actually made this particular Lever Brothers soap ad as opposed to J. Walter Thompson, because now I have it in the tear sheet files. So that's some of the stuff that you can find. On top of that, there's many speeches. So I need to warn people who are interested in the BBDO records that it's not a depository of the central files of the agency. So you're not going to file the account executive memos, really. You're not going to find the sort of internal documents. But what you will find is what was kept by the library. BBDO had one of the largest corporate libraries in the ad industry, and they kept a lot of stuff. So they kept a huge number of publications, both that coming out of their own agency, but from other agencies as well. They kept all the speeches. So their leaders were constantly giving speeches about issues of the day. So Tom Dillon, who was leading the agency in the 60s, is giving all these speeches about how, the youth market is a joke and we got to ignore all those people with long hair. So the sort of social tensions among, within the ad industry as it starts going through a big change in the 1960s are all there in these records. And also, I just lost my train of thought.
Well, it's okay. I'm sitting here listening, and it seems like advertising agency archives are uniquely positioned to be rich source for no matter what your particular interest is in business or culture or any number of different areas of research. You can use this collection to start getting at them. And that's just so fascinating. It's such a unique resource.
Oh, I just remembered what I was going to mention. Another really, really interesting, I think, resource in the BBDO records
Mhm.
are their house organs. House organ is the
Mm.
word that we use to describe the internal newsletters. And these newsletters were designed for the employees. They were not designed for the public. In fact, many of them say on it, destroy after reading. But in the records, we have um, extreme runs from the 1920s through the 1990s.
Wow.
So 70 years of reporting on not just what BBDO was doing, but also what was going on in the industry, what their ad strategies were, what their campaigns were, their clients. And that is kind of, I look at the newsletters as kind of the spine of trying to build a narrative, because it's in the newsletters that I can find, dates and names and events and, for me, programs and people's names, because it was in the newsletter that you often found out who was actually doing the ad campaign or, writing the March of Time or whatever it was. It's in the newsletter because they're bragging, employees are being celebrated to the other employees. And none of that was in public, maybe in some of the trade magazines, but a lot of that information's not in the trade magazines. It was only publicized internally. And again, that goes back to that problem of ever being able to find attribution for any kind of advertising text. It's always difficult, which is why I always tell people who are interested in researching anything about advertising is to start with documentation, start with what exists. And the BBDO records are a great place to start. You go in there and you try to find out what they have. And I actually had the opportunity to see this material when it was still at BBDO. And I generated a number of articles about it because I didn't even know the Armstrong Circle Theater was a news docudrama live on television in the 1950s that was produced by BBDO until I was going through their records. And I was like, well, this is an interesting story. And I published an article in Business History Review about that effort to, polish Armstrong's corporate image and also inform the public about the issues of the day and the importance of overcoming adversity. And that's also when I found out about March of Time. I had no idea March of Time was produced by BBDO until I was looking, through their boxes and found a file of information about it. So I usually tell people, don't go into any kind of archive really saying, I want to tell a story about X, except in a general sense. Go into that archive and say, I went in saying, well, I'm interested in radio and television. What can I find? And what I found was stuff about, those particular programs. I didn't find other things. I only found one thing, the General Motors radio program, which was about the idea of traveling by car. It was written by Bruce Barton rather than selling the cars. So I didn't really find that much about that program. So if I went in saying, I want to write an article about that General Motors program, I would have been disappointed. I would have only found the one thing. So I just encourage people to be open to that serendipity and be willing to see the story when you find something like that in an archive, rather than go into an archive and be frustrated that it doesn't have, the entire backstory. There's not a lot of memos that tell you a lot about, say, the relationship between, Alex Osborne and Bruce Barton. Everything was kind of designed to document the agency's successes rather than its failures, and also to document how they evolved over time. So a lot of the material was stuff that the public relations department at BBDO kept. So they're not going to keep the stuff that's ugly. So for example, Roy Durstein was forced out in 1939, and there's not a lot in the records about why. There's a little bit, But it's the kind of thing that they were very embarrassed about. The agency was about to go bankrupt, in part because his idea of running the agency was that everybody did everything all the time. So an account executive, instead of just interfacing with the client and going out to, dinner with them, was also supposed to be creating the ads. And then the people who were writing the ads were also supposed to interface with it. It was very confusing. And his management style was apparently harming the economic health of the agency. So they forced him out, but they don't want to talk about why, except in the general sense. They don't want to get, there's gossip out there. You can dig around, but what I'm trying to say, you're not going to find the gossip in these records. You're going to kind of find the public facing version of things, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful.
Yeah, it would seem that this firm that was chiefly involved in managing the public face of other firms would also be very self-conscious, as it were, of managing its own image.
Yes, and in fact, one of the things I learned was that they're kind of embarrassed about how old they are. I mean, 1891 was a long time ago. And the ad industry is very much a forward-facing industry. They're always cutting edge. They're always doing the next new thing. And they don't like to pitch themselves as being old hat. And so one reason it's really hard to find any kind of archival material for an ad agency is that they kind of want to hide their old stuff. They're afraid that people will make fun of it or will make them look bad. And as everybody knows, I mean, ads of the the 20th century are full of racism and sexism and whatever kind of ism, ethnic stereotypes, because that was acceptable at that time in that context. And they thought those kinds of images would appeal to the markets they were trying to appeal to. The fact that they don't work anymore doesn't mean that they didn't exist. So as an historian, you have to go back and say, yeah, this is what they were doing. This is why they were doing it. They thought this would make some people feel good and buy the product. So that's another big reason that ad agencies don't tend to talk a huge amount about their history. They only talk about sort of the good stuff or the stuff that doesn't make them look bad. They're very selective, like when they do these kind of credentials, which are pamphlets in which they talk about the kinds of campaigns they've done. And most of those are designed to show to potential clients. They don't show the stuff that makes them look in any way, shape, or form bad. So what you're going to find in records like BBD&O is somewhat sanitized, but that doesn't mean that you can't, as a researcher, triangulate, use other sources, draw your own conclusions and analysis from what you're looking at. We're not talking about a hypodermic needle theory of communication in which you look at a racist ad and you become racist. You recognize it for what it is, and then you discuss it. So Pepsi, for example, is a really interesting company in how they did parallel advertising for what they call the special markets, which is the African-American market and white markets. BBD&O was a pioneer in marketing to African-Americans as a white ad agency. They were the first one to hire an African-American as an executive, rather than as a janitor or a porter. That was back in the 50s, Clarence Holt. They also were one of the few agencies that had a top woman executive, Jean Rinlaub. She started there in the 30s, and by the 1950s, she was on the executive committee. And of course, she specialized in marketing to housewives. She ran focus groups within the agencies of women all over the agency, whether they were secretaries or copywriters or, coffee girls or whatever. And she was really influential. She ran the Betty Crocker cake mix ads in the early 50s. So if you're interested in some of those issues, you will find material in the BBD&O records that can help you not only flesh out that story a little bit more, but bring a different perspective to it. Jean Rinlaub's ideas about how her advertising work was helping women, helping expand options for housewives, I think is, really interesting to try to understand within the context of her era.
It seems like that claim has really come up quite a few times, that ad agencies, in particular the folks at BBD&O, are making the claim that they're doing a social good, that they're providing a service, that there's even an underlying claim of pedagogical function going on here. Could you perhaps unpack that a little bit further for us?
Yes, absolutely. It's really hard for us to imagine this today, after over 100 years of mass advertising.
Right.
But in the 19th century, advertising was kind of crude, and a lot of it was just out and out fraudulent. Before we had the Federal Trade Commission, before we had the Food and Drug Act, patent medicines were the top advertisers in a lot of print media. And it was just fraudulent, 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 fraudulent. And the problem is that consumers, a lot of them figured out that a lot of this was just fraudulent. So advertising had a very bad reputation as just being a place where crooks and swindlers went to try to, swindle people. And so at the turn of the 20th century, there was a big effort to professionalize advertising, to make it more respectable. And part of that was to do what, people like Bruce Barton did, who, by the way, was a former journalist like Roy Durstein was, in that he said, instead of doing all this fraudulent stuff, what we need to do is be honest, sincere, truthful, and we need to change this whole view of advertising as being, the realm of fakery. We really need to, uplift our history, and we need to, advertising can hold manufacturers accountable, right? So if a manufacturer makes a claim in an ad for its product, and then that doesn't do that, what Bruce Barton is saying is, well, if we advertise honestly, then the consumer will begin to trust what we're saying. So it's about building trust. And also remember, in this sort of turn of the 20th century, industrialization, urbanization, all those fun things, right? Mass production. A lot of people have written about this as sort of creating a consumer culture, or propagandizing consumption. But I take a different view of it, which is that when you look back at that period, there really was this conundrum about, well, how do you build, an economy that's based on mass production, and how do you bring the advantages of packaged goods to people who might otherwise not trust the packaged good, because of course they'd lived through patent medicines. Patent medicines were packaged goods that were frauds, right? And so it's about this process of building credibility. And this is true of the news media as well. Newspapers in the 19th century printed tons of lies and myths and propaganda. There was no sort of fact checking. Truthfulness was not really a major concern. It was more about selling papers. But when in the early 20th century, you have a kind of collaboration between the ad industry and the news media to create more credibility for both. So you have the rise of objectivity in news media and journalism. You have the New York Times, all that's fit to print. And this goes hand in hand with the advertising industry likewise saying, look, you can read our ad and trust it. And the news industry is saying, you can read our news article and trust it. So both industries worked in collaboration to kind of build a more trustworthy, credible, believable, kind of informational style. And because at that time, information about products and kind of training consumers on how to use products, or why it's more important to use Rinso as opposed to another laundry soap, they used a very didactic reason why style of advertising. Use Rinso because it doesn't make your hands red, it gets your sheets white, it's fast, it makes lots of suds. So it's very informational. And today, when we look back at those old ads, they look kind of silly to us because we're used to ads that are not informational at all. We're used to ads that are all about emotional appeal. So McDonald's ad will be about a family bonding over their Big Macs, and a Pepsi ad will be about young people having fun, and a Ford ad will be about how much fun it is to drive the car. And there's no product information there at all. And that's because the ad industry since the 1960s is pretty much moved away from product information in large part because they found that by the mid 20th century, consumers had become a little bit jaundiced or less believing of the product claims, because a lot of product claims were still full of hyperbole. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend, and Lucky Strikes are good for your throat. I mean, come on. And so when they move away from that and go into the emotional appeals, you can't prove or disprove an emotional appeal. You can't say, no, families don't bond when they go to McDonald's, right? You just go, oh, that feels good. Oh, you're watching it and you sort of get the feeling, and it has nothing to do with the product, but it makes you feel good. And so a lot of advertising is really designed to push certain emotional buttons with the viewer. And it's not really about the product. It's just an association. Like, you're going to feel good about McDonald's because McDonald's cares about families, and McDonald's wants families to be together, and so on. So this whole shift takes place in the mid 20th century, but everything before that looks very odd to us. And I think, especially when historians go back and look at that era, they see it as disingenuous. They see it as kind of, I don't want to say conspiratorial, but they see it as, this is propaganda for consumption. And I look at it from a different perspective, which is coming out of the patent medicine era. This is less conspiratorial and propagandistic and more about, creating a sense of credibility, not just about among advertising and news media, but also in terms of this whole system of mass production. And that raised living standards for most Americans, many Americans. And so when people like Bruce Barton would talk about, how great all of this is, it's sort of easy to laugh at him in retrospect, because of course we know the underbelly of the fact that some of the people whose boats didn't rise with the tide, the racial exclusionary policies, so on and so forth. But I think that even though it's easy for us to point out the hypocrisies, I think it's also important for us to take seriously some of their beliefs, that they weren't disingenuous, that they really thought that they were building a better world than the 19th century had been.
Well, Cynthia, what a rich set of sources, and thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us today. It's just fascinating.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I hope you've inspired lots of folks to come to Hagley and use the BBD&O collection and our other related collections. For the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.